Chapter 2. Original Sin. Inbound from the northern savannah, the original home of the Mel and Mende-speaking peoples who migrated in the 15th century, or from the Western Sea, as the first Americo settlers encountered it in the 19th, or from above, as the modern-day visitor approaches, nothing grabs the attention of the newcomer to Liberia quite like the trees. The Debima, Piptodoniastrum africanum, with its tapering reddish-brown trunk, is the most common species. There are thousands of them, each a foot or two across and 50 to 100 feet high, per acre. But the Debima is far from the most striking example. Grander and more verdant are the tigerwood, the aptly named ironwood, and mahoganies of bewildering variety, all vying for sky beneath the king of the forest, the makor, or African black cherry, 8 feet in diameter and 200 feet tall. To J. W. Lucian Beale, physician and U.S. government agent to Monrovia in the 1840s, Liberia was a vision of fecundity itself. Far as the eye can reach, he wrote, from the highest points of land in the vicinity of the ocean, the whole country presents the appearance of a deep, unbroken forest with hilltop rising above hilltop toward the vast interior, hills and valleys covered with the verdure of perpetual spring. Others were reminded of a boundless garden. The Reverend Samuel Williams, a missionary in the 1850s, wrote of a cornucopia of wild-growing tropical fruit, the orange, lemon, lime, soursop, guava, pawpaw, mango, plum, pineapple, and many others of less importance. Not every visitor was so impressed, however. William Nesbitt, a free black reconnoitering the country for possible emigration, had a different take, as the title of his 1855 travelogue, 4 Months in Liberia, or African Colonization Exposed, leads the reader to suspect. No man there has now or ever had 5 acres of land cleared and in cultivation, and I am one of those who believe that it is impossible to clear the land, owing to the dense and rapid growth of the bush. The nearest description that I can give this bush is to call it a bramble. Nothing can exceed the density and rapidity of its growth. Everything grows crooked and thorny. The rain makes for the lushness. Mile for mile, Liberia gets about as much of it as any country on earth. The northwest coast, where the Americos first settled, receives 200 inches in an average year. And it falls biblically, in great torrents. On a March day in 1954, the University of Liberia weather station in Monrovia recorded an inch in less than 8 minutes. At the height of the summer rainy season, the downpours are relentless. Again, a disapproving Nesbitt described the worst of it. The rainy season is awful. It rained without ceasing for 3 weeks so hard, that we could not see outside the house, and, for the last 4 months, we have not had 10 dry days. I thought I had seen it rain in the States, but find I was mistaken. In the winter months, when high-pressure systems above the Sahara and the Harmattan winds drop 1,000,000 tons of desert grit on the forest canopy, weeks can go by without a drop, the season defined by the scorching equatorial sun. While some settlers highlighted in their letters home the ocean breezes that kept evenings cooler than might be expected, the origin of the name the Windward Coast, no one could ignore the midday onslaught. Even the Reverend Williams, who wrote his 1857 book, 4 Years in Liberia, as a riposte to the querulous Nesbitt, admitted that the heat was brutal. After pointing out that the thermometer rarely topped 90 degrees, he added, "But this was always in the shade. To go into the sun there was a great difference. It was imprudent to be out from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Yet there were those who called this land of extremes home." Some archaeologists theorize that humans have inhabited the rainforests of Liberia for at least 50,000 years, but the region's unforgiving climate washed away the evidence long ago. Of the native inhabitants when the first colonists arrived, the oldest were the Mel and Kwa-speaking peoples. Both were part of the Niger-Congo family of Africans. The main distinction between the two was in their social organization. Mel-speaking peoples, who inhabited a broad swath of territory from the Niger Delta in the east to the interior of Sierra Leone in the west, developed more structured societies. It was they who developed the rituals of Poro and Sande, initiation associations for males and females respectively, which created a rigid, age-based social hierarchy. The chiefs of the Mel speakers derived authority from their lineage. Kwa societies, by contrast, were more anarchic. Villages largely governed themselves while the local headmen were usually chosen by councils of elders, to whom they were answerable. It was a Kwa people, the day, that Ayres and Stockton sat down to negotiate with at Cape Mesurado in December 1821. 2 events in the middle part of the last millennium had a dramatic impact on the human geography of the Windward Coast. One was the collapse of Songhai, and of its legendary metropolis, Timbuktu, the last great indigenous trading empire of the Western Sudan. Its demise sent large numbers of Mel and the related Mande-speaking peoples southward into the interior of what is now Liberia. The migration pushed the existing Kwa, Mel, and Mande inhabitants into the coastal rainforest, though a number of anthropologists conjecture that members of the two former groups were there to begin with. In either case, these tribes were farmers, not hunters and gatherers like the Kwi, Pygmy, of the Congo. They laboriously hacked away clearings in the jungle and planted their crops of cassava and rice in the depleted red laterite soil. Meanwhile the Kru, another Kwa-speaking people, took to the sea, as fishermen and eventually crewmen on European ships. The second major event was the arrival of Portuguese traders in the 15th century, though they were not the first visitors from the sea. That distinction belongs to Hanno of Carthage, whose crew, according to the Greeks, sailed to the region in 550 BC and bagged hairy creatures they called gorillas but which were probably chimpanzees. The Romans also made tentative forays into the Atlantic but otherwise no ships plied the seas off the windward coast until the Portuguese explorations of the 15th century. In 1461, the mariner Pedro de Sintra left the first permanent European mark on the region, naming Cape Mesurado, Portuguese for moderated, probably for the gentler surf on the headland's leeward side, and transporting the first native of the land to Europe. The man would return 2 years later with a pile of gifts, a working knowledge of Portuguese, and many marvelous tales. Other mariners followed, as the stretch of coast between Cape Mount and Cape Palmas, at roughly the present-day borders of Liberia, became a profitable trading run. The quarry was pepper, specifically Aframoma melegueta, better known as grains of paradise. Until the Portuguese opened up the spice trade with the East Indies in the early 16th century, the piquant melegueta was Europe's favorite source of gastronomic heat. For 400 years, maps of the littoral bore the name the Grain Coast. Still, despite the demand for melegueta, trade with the coast remained slight through the early 19th century. The shoreline offered no natural harbors, at least none free of treacherous sandbars, and the steady winds produced heavy surf. Not surprisingly, as the Portuguese, and then the Spanish, Danish, Dutch, Swedish, French, English, and Americans, turned from trade in peppers to trade in people, the Grain Coast was bypassed for more accessible points north, notably, the Gambia and Senegal rivers, east, the Slave Coast, or Nigeria, and south, Angola. While slave trading was not entirely unknown along this stretch of coast, the land that would be named for liberty did not have large slave factories like those at Guerre Island, Elmina, and Luanda. Still, local tribes engaged in the practice and were violently jealous of any interference. There were small barracoons up and down the coast, including at Cape Mesurado, that were visited from time to time by legitimate slave traders before the 1807 British ban, and by smugglers thereafter. Slave dealing was the locals' best source of the hard currency needed to buy the coveted goods, rum, tobacco, guns, brought by white traders. Stockton and Ayres were well aware of what went on along the windward coast. "By the purchase you have made," Stockton later communicated in his first official letter to the ACS Board, "a fatal blow has been struck against the local slave trade, under which it may indeed linger some time, but must eventually expire." Knowing that their cause was not welcome among the crew, the agents demonstrated their pacific intent by displaying no weapons, though Stockton hid a brace of pistols on his person, a risk that would prove decisive. They brought casks of rum and hogsheads of tobacco as gifts, though Ayres soon began to question whether these would be enough to ensure their safety. While sitting and waiting for the king, under the shed of a crewman, the people kept collecting, most of them with knives hanging at their sides, he recalled. "I began to think there might be some truth in the reports that the locals were not friendly." Message after message was sent to King Peter, the local day chief, without bringing a reply. Finally, one of the natives spoke up. "The king be fool, he no talk English, I his mouth, what I say, king say, what you want." Whether or not Ayres was taken aback by such typical Kwa disrespect for authority, he launched, in his high-pitched voice, into the ACS talking points: "We come in peace, we come to trade, we come to offer you civilization." This, Ayres admitted, immediately excited their suspicions that we were going to break in upon the customs of their forefathers. When King Peter showed up later that day, an aide with an English umbrella protecting him from the sun, the two agents began to compliment him shamelessly, though in a thoroughly Protestant sort of way. "We did not fail to let him know the high estimation in which we held him for veracity and punctuality," Ayres reported, "and that this had induced us to prefer him to some other chiefs." Peter was duly flattered but unmoved. He could offer the two islands at the mouth of the Mesurado River, small muddy flats barely above the high tide mark, but not the headland. If any white man was to settle on it, he explained through his interpreter, a local mulatto trader named John Mills, then King Peter would die, and his women would cry aplenty. The agents pressed their case, emphasizing the trade the colony would bring and keeping the Christianity and civilization part to themselves. "We took great care, after our former experience, not to offer to their consideration any views which they could not fully comprehend," Ayres remembered, condescendingly. Finally, Peter relented. He would talk to his headman and return the next day to make book, local pidgin for the peculiar white man's practice of consummating deals on paper. He then left with his entourage and the tobacco and rum. The next day, the agents found themselves waiting once again, and begged the local headman to send for Peter. When he showed up 3 hours late, so much for the agent's praise, there was little talk of land. Instead, Ayres noted, the unfortunate subject of the slave trade was broached, and we again broke up the palaver. Our prospect at this time was very dull. Despite Ayres and Stockton's avoidance of the topic, Peter and the other chiefs understood that these men and their plans presented a grave threat to the local business. Stockton in his naval uniform could only have reminded them of the British officers who had fought slave smugglers in the region for the previous 15 years, while Ayres's religious talk was a sign that the interlopers were not interested in a slice of the slave trade. As for the former slaves from across the ocean the two white men spoke of, the chiefs were not so sure what their intentions were but probably surmised that they, too, would cause problems and disruptions that could cost the natives access to their most readily available supply of foreign trade goods. When Peter failed to show on the third day, the agents decided that if the king would not come to them, they would go to the king. But, the anxious Ayres noted, to go to the town was to place ourselves entirely in the power of a nation who had always been represented to us so savage as to render it unsafe to land on their shore without being completely armed. With a crewman in the lead, the two made their way, wallowing through the mud, passing through thick and dark swamps to King Peter's town, some 6 miles into the interior of what the settlers would later call Bushrod Island. The trek, it turned out, was the least of the agents' difficulties. While day custom demanded the two agents be treated as guests, their hosts made it clear they were not welcome. When Peter finally made his appearance in the palaver hut he shook their hands but dispensed with the diplomatic approach. "What you want that land for?" he barked. Ayres made his well-worn pitch once more. The room began to fill with men and murmuring. One crewman said loudly that he had seen the new colonists on Sherbro, and that all they did was quarrel among themselves. Another man pointed at Stockton and claimed to have seen him seizing a French slave ship. The room rose to its feet, Ayres recalled, as the murmuring turned into horrid war shouting. Stockton, who had sidled his way to the king's side, drew his pistols and pointed one at the head of the king. He then handed the other to Ayres and told him to shoot anyone who threatened them. The crowd, Ayres recalled later, prostrated itself and Stockton began to lecture them, Mills interpreted. It was a theatrical performance. With his free hand raised to heaven, the Navy lieutenant swore he would not be made a fool of. For 3 days, he said, Peter's people had drunk the rum and smoked the tobacco he and Ayres had brought, with no intention of dealing with them honorably. At this point, according to Ayres, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing Stockton in ethereal light. It would become one of the iconic moments in Liberian lore. The threat worked. Ayres wrote, "I believe the old king was afraid of being served as the French vessel was, for he soon came to, and promised to call some more kings, and meet us on the shore next morning, and make a book, which was to give us the land." On December 15, King Peter and 5 other chiefs put their mark to the first treaty ever reached between the ACS and the natives. 3 casks of tobacco, 5 casks of beef, 1 barrel of rum, 6 muskets, 12 guns, 3 barrels of gunpowder, 20 looking-glasses, 4 umbrellas, 1 box of the proverbial beads. These were among the $300 worth of goods Ayres and Stockton exchanged with Peter and the local chiefs for a 40-mile stretch of territory with the several hundred-foot-high Cape Mesurado, future site of the Liberian capital, Monrovia, at its center. For generations, Liberian schoolchildren, both the descendants of the settlers and the civilized natives they shared their classrooms with, would memorize the terms of the trade as shorthand for the ignorance of the natives and the cleverness of the colonists. It was a myth not unlike that of the $24 Dutch payment to the Lenape people for the island of Manhattan, and indeed, taking 200 years of inflation into account, it amounted to about the same deal. By the 1970s, however, revisionist historians would turn the myth inside out. Emphasizing Stockton's gun at Peter's head, they would condemn the deal as Liberia's original sin, the first of many acts of duplicity and arrogance perpetrated by the colonists. Neither version of events does justice to the facts of the deal, though. Peter and the other chiefs signed it the day after Stockton drew his pistol on the king, when they could have brought plenty of their own guns to bear on the two agents. But the real problem with each version is that there was no deal. in the agent's sense of the term, to begin with. As with their counterparts in the New World, the natives of the Grain Coast knew nothing of fee simple land ownership. Though they were surely aware that white men had a different take on the subject, a glance at the British takeover of Sierra Leone would have told them as much. As far as they were concerned, the black-white men, as they came to call the settlers, might live at Mesurado as guests or sojourners, but it was not theirs. And even if they did accept the concept of land ownership, no king of the proudly anarchic day would ever have the authority to make such a deal. Peter, much to his regret, would very soon learn this lesson. And so, to theirs, would the colonists. Lord Carey's first glimpse of Cape Mesurado came a few weeks after the treaty's signing, from the deck of the Augusta, in the company of Ayres and a dozen of the Haler male colonists. Though lacking the drama of Freetown's mountainous backdrop, the colonists' new home was not without its charms, a calm bay and dense mangrove swamps, all bathed in the pink of an equatorial dawn. By squinting, to blur the distinctive shape of palm fronds, some of the colonists might have been reminded of a summer's morning on the lower Chesapeake, from which Carey had sailed the year before. "If you think of coming out, you need not fear," he wrote to a friend back in Virginia, "for you will find as fine a spot as ever your eyes beheld." But the ironic scene concealed a region in turmoil. As the Augusta carefully made its way over the sandbar at the bay's mouth, the local Day emerged from their huts on the banks, making unwelcoming gestures. The tattooed crewman who rowed out to the schooner to offer his lightering services briefed Carey and the others. King Peter had been arrested and was now the prisoner of neighboring chiefs. What the local monarch had warned Ayres and Stockton might come to pass had come to pass. For selling the Cape, Peter was to have his head chopped off. The richly forested Cape, rising gradually from gentle leeward waters to cliffs several hundred feet above the crashing surf of the Atlantic, was now off limits. Instead, the colonists would have to settle on tiny Dozoa, later Providence, Island in the bay. The thought must have made Carey shudder. The low-lying spit of land bore a close resemblance to fatal Camp Hilaire. But if Ayres was shaking, it was in anger. A deal was a deal. As he told Carey, he would explain to the headmen exactly what it meant to scratch their X's on a white man's contract. 10 days later, the agent, once again seated in the palaver hut at King Peter's Town, with the local headmen and a handful of armed colonists also in attendance, attempted to do just that. But the Africans were in no mood to haggle. Their answer was they were not willing. "We should have the land," Ayres later wrote to the ACS secretary, Elias Caldwell, "that I now take back the money, which we had paid King Peter, and leave the country." After the legalistic agent pointed out that the natives had drunk the rum and smoked the tobacco, a headman named King Willie turned to him and patiently explained what he thought a white man's contract was really worth. "He would eat all our tobacco and drink all our rum," Ayres quoted him saying, "and then he would drive us away." The headmen picked themselves up and walked off, all but Peter, that is. He was desperate. Big tears rolling down his furrowed cheek, he pleaded with Ayres. "They will kill we, and we no want to die." The colonists had to leave. A 1962 Liberian reader for elementary school students written by A. Doris Henrys, wife of the Speaker of the Liberian House of Representatives, described Chief Boson in terms that would not have been unfamiliar to American schoolchildren learning about Squanto and the Pilgrims. According to Henrys, Boson was the proverbial good native. He was a friend. Boson helped the pioneers. Once again, however, a Liberian myth, like all myths, diverges from history. Boson's real name was Sao Boso, a half-Portuguese moniker. The odd English spelling derived from his youthful stint as a petty officer aboard British ships. Like his better-known and more ruthless South African contemporary, Shaka Zulu, Boson, a member of the trade-oriented Mandingo nation, though lacking a chiefly lineage of his own, had forged through will, physical strength, and statecraft a broad confederation of tribes, an unusual accomplishment in the fractious political environment of the Windward Coast. From his capital at Bapulu, several days' caravan from Mesurado, he made his influence felt far and wide. Ayres's successor, Yehudi Ashman, later captured, in a Rousseauan portrait of the noble savage, some of the attributes that had permitted Boson to rise above his station, to a stature approaching 7 feet in height, perfectly erect, muscular, and finely proportioned, a countenance noble, intelligent, and full of animation. He unites great comprehension and acuity of mind. In other words, Boson was perceptive enough to see in the settlers a potential trading partner, and therefore to side with them in their moment of peril. Several months after the settlers' arrival, Boson descended on the Cape with his entourage, including no fewer than 20 of his wives, to indulge his curiosity about the strange newcomers, African in mien but European in dress, and resolve the discord between them and his vassals with a traditional palaver. With great satisfaction Ayres noted the locals' discomfort. They were equally afraid of our guns and of Boson. Ayres's testimony, here as elsewhere, is self-aggrandizing and untrustworthy. The natives were surely more afraid of Boson, for camped several miles away were 200 of his well-armed soldiers. Boson chose for his court a palaver hut set at the center of one of the native towns near Mesurado, a 25-foot-long structure of grass and wood resting on a raised earthen floor. Ayres waited as Boson ruled on a docket of cases unrelated to the settlers. Finally, his turn came to make his case. "I had not made war yet," he wrote in a summary of his address for the ACS board, "but if they attempted to drive us from this land, I would show them what fighting was." The local chiefs, he wrote, appeared uneasy and said one to another, "Oh, look, white man getting mad." But Boson apparently just laughed. And by this, I found I had touched the right chord, and did not spare the invectives. Ayres had read the situation correctly this time. When Boson finally rose to speak, it was to dress down his vessels. He affirmed that a deal was a deal. He noted that while the headmen said one thing and Ayres and the colonists said another, it was useless to multiply words about it, but he should like to see the man who would attempt to drive them away. The headmen then retired for several minutes. Upon their return, Ayres recalled, they were sheepish. If the settlers liked the Cape, they might have it. The chiefs would not receive anything for it. The tension lifted. The chiefs said during the remembrance of the oldest of their kings there had been no such thing known as war between black man and white man. The official ceremony came the next day. With hundreds of locals looking on, Ayres, Carey, and the colonists took formal possession of the Cape, hoisting the American flag for the first time in sub-Saharan Africa and firing a salute with their one working cannon. When it was over, the colonists watched as Boson and the chiefs took their leave while dark gray clouds rolled in from the Atlantic. But the Cape was theirs in name only. They had no shelter, not even a clearing in the forest, and the rainy season was beginning to set in. Despite the vows of friendship, no natives would work for the settlers, no matter how many iron bars, the currency of the coast, were offered. The burly Carey led a detachment upriver to hack palm fronds for roofing. After an exhausting day's labor, dripping sweat and bitten raw by insects, they returned with barely enough materials to build a single hut. The recently confident Ayres gathered the colonists together to tell them that the muddy island was a death sentence. "Let us return to Sierra Leone," he suggested, "wait out the season, and come back after the rains to start anew." Some of the colonists agreed. Carey's missionary partner Colin Teague, for one, was ready to abandon the entire endeavor. But most settlers, including Carey, remained determined. They had rather risk their lives, Ayres quoted him saying, than to run the least hazard of losing a place possessing so many advantages. But it was the settler Elijah Johnson, a New Jersey-born son of slaves who would become the father of Liberia's 11th president, whose words would echo in 100 Pioneer Day speeches down the years, "I have been 2 years searching a home in Africa and I have found it, and here I remain." With Johnson in charge, the ailing Ayres sailed back to America by way of Sierra Leone. The settlers set out to build their village on the Cape. As was their time at Camp Hilaire, the early months on Providence Island would be remembered as a time of wanton fever. The storms and downpours came especially hard that year, keeping ships away while supplies dwindled. There were skirmishes with the day as the settlers hammered and sawed and laid stone. These encounters consisted of a shot or two fired from more into the curtain of dense green beyond the clearing, but that was surely as unnerving to the colonists as the sudden aches and chills that signaled another bout of fever. For all their kowtowing to Boson, the headmen were divided over what was to be done about the colonists. That was the word brought back by King Bob Gray, a minor chief recruited by the colonists that summer to spy on the conclaves held in the villages around Cape Mesurado. The elders, Gray said, were debating furiously among themselves, who exactly were these interlopers? And what were they after? Peter, his head saved from the chopping block by Boson's intervention, argued for inclusion, according to Gray's account of the debates. They were not a settlement of foreigners, but of their countrymen and friends, as was proved by the identity of their color. They had a right to reside in their country. King George, whose ancestral lands included the contested Cape, remained unconvinced. The Americans were strangers who had forgotten their attachment to the land of their fathers, he insisted. Maybe so, Peter allowed, but they might be expected to turn all the civilization which they had learned abroad to the improvement of their common country. The only thing they brought, George countered, was a predilection for meddling in the affairs of others. We have already found to our cost that these new people were hostile to the slave trade, He proclaimed to the increasingly receptive chiefs, what was to be expected from them when they should have grown into a powerful nation. Now was the best chance they would have to get rid of them. The colonists were weak and few in number. Many of the newly arrived and another boatload of settlers had landed in August, were sick and could be easily overcome. The only question was the means, sudden surprise or a wasting and harassing blockade. While concerned enough to strengthen their defenses, refitting cannons, erecting a palisade, and widening the clearing around the settlement, the colonists and Ashman, a former seminary teacher and their new agent, treated Gray's reports skeptically. "There is not a headman within 50 miles of us, who can arm properly 50 men. They are cowardly in the extreme, and have little control over their men," Ashman noted in his journal. "It is morally certain, we shall not be taken by surprise." Yet Gray offered ever more worrisome reports. Messengers, he said, were being sent far and wide to recruit the tribes in the area with promises of loot and slaves, which must have been chilling to the colonists. If the colonists believed that the chiefs would not dare challenge Bosson's ruling, Gray was not so sure. Then the reports stopped. As Gray explained to Ashman, the plan of attack being left to the lead warriors, whose trade it is to concert and conduct it, was not to be learned. This ominous sign was compounded by the unexplained departure, one by one, of the native youths at the Cape, who had been placed there by their elders to learn of civilized ways and to assure peace with the settlers. They were receiving, Ashman suspected, secret intelligence conveyed them by their friends. The native canoes crossing and recrossing the Mesurado River on November 10, 1822, made it evident that Ashman had been wrong. The chiefs had the will and the men for an attack. By evening, there were hundreds of native warriors camped a half-mile from the settlement's flimsy palisade and its few dozen defenders. At dawn, under dusky skies, they attacked, some firing muskets, most charging with spears. The settlers, several falling to gunfire, were quickly driven back inside the palisade. Had the enemy at this instant pressed their advantage, Ashman wrote later, it is hardly conceivable that they should have failed of entire success. But as Carey, who was overseeing the settlement's defenses, witnessed, the natives stopped to loot the settler huts they had overrun. The settlers fired their guns, forcing the natives' front lines to retreat headlong into the oncoming rush of their second wave. The result was pure chaos. Imagination can scarcely figure to itself a throng of human beings in a more capital state of exposure to the destructive power of the machinery of modern warfare. Ashman wrote years later, still breathless at the victory. 800 men were here pressed shoulder to shoulder, and all exposed to a gun of great power. Every shot literally spent its force in a solid mass of living human flesh. By 8 o'clock that night, the fighting was over. A savage yell was raised, which filled the dismal forest with a momentary horror. It gradually died away, and the whole host disappeared. The colonists continued their cannon fire at the retreating canoes. Over the following several days, the natives returned for their dead. The colonists had suffered just 8 casualties, 4 killed and 4 injured. An equal number of children had been seized by the attackers, though, and their fate was unknown. Moreover, the battle had left the colonists low on food, medicine, and ammunition, the latter insufficient for a single hour's defense of the place if hotly attacked. And while the natives had retreated from the Cape, their army remained camped nearby. The colonists dispatched a messenger. They wanted peace but were prepared to carry on the war, and can render it immensely more bloody and destructive than you felt it before. This was a bluff. A sally of familiar replies came back. The settlers deceived us. They paid for the island and took the Cape. Native traders had been cheated and roughly abused by the settlers, storekeeper. The colonists had not fulfilled their promise of instructing the people. Remedy these injuries, the headman said, and we will gladly make peace. But as Boson had pointed out in a different context, this was just more idle talk. What really pitted settler against native again went unspoken. The slave trade, a business for the natives, was an abomination to the settlers, who were determined to wipe it out as soon as they had the means to do so. That was the implication of the ACS's mission to spread the benefits of legitimate commerce to Africa. For those who had escaped slavery in America, it was something more. It was a responsibility and a duty to the millions of their brethren in slavery back home. They would prefer to do it by persuasion, but the natives' resistance made it appear that it would be achieved only by force. Meanwhile, having witnessed the settlers' arms in action, the chiefs must have understood that the settlers' ability to carry out that mission would only grow once they had firmly established themselves at the Cape. And so there was nothing to negotiate and everything to fight for. Within a few weeks, the two sides would be at it again. For more than 100 years, from the mid-19th century through the mid-20th, the people of Liberia, Descendants of both settlers and civilized natives would celebrate December 1st as the nation's second national holiday, after Independence Day. They called it Matilda Newport Day. Government offices and schools closed. Barefoot children paraded the streets and politicians made patriotic speeches. The centerpiece of the celebrations was a reenactment of the day in 1822 when a lonely band of settlers defended itself against the native hordes bent on their destruction. Groups of citizens dressed up, some donning the frock coats and stovepipe hats of the settlers, others the pelts and face paint that passed for African warrior garb. The natives would grab their spears, begin to shriek, and charge the settlers, who braced in formation beyond makeshift wooden palisades, muskets at the ready. The dramatic climax of the reenactment occurred when the eponymous elder made her appearance and put an ember to the fire hole of a cannon. If the timing was right, the blank discharge would catch the natives as they were about to storm the barricades. Newport would once again turn the tide of battle, saving the settlers in their moment of greatest peril and assuring Liberia's survival. This version of events, Molly Pitcher at the Alamo, as it were, is more national myth than history. Colonial records show there was in fact a Matilda Newport in Meseraudo in 1822 and, given the settlers' precarious position, woman colonists did participate in the colony's defense. But there is no contemporary account of a pipe-smoking woman in the thick of the fighting. The holiday would fall into disrepute and eventually be abandoned in the 1970s, when Liberians, including, for the first time, radical young native intellectuals, began to contest national identity. The ritual humiliation inherent in the reenactments was a not-so-subtle reminder that some Liberians were more Liberian than others. The second battle for the Cape went down much like the first. Hundreds of natives, in greater numbers than before, were again driven back by the outnumbered settlers. While Ashman, Carey, and the others knelt in prayer and attributed their victory to the special guardianship of divine providence, the records show it was their artillery, whether fired by a pipe-smoking Newport or not, that carried the day. None of the kings of this part of the coast are without cannon, Ashman noted. But to load a great gun, is with them the business of half an hour, and they were seriously disposed to attribute to sorcery the art of charging and firing these destructive machines from 4 to 6 times in the minute. After the battle, when a British captain passing through, the celebrated Alexander Gordon Lying, the first European to reach Timbuktu, offered to mediate between the colonists and the chiefs, he found the latter entirely exhausted, and, overwhelmed with vexation and shame, their warriors dispersed far and wide and their resources, entirely exhausted. The chiefs agreed to a truce with the settlers, though it remained an uneasy one. Captain Robert Spence of the U.S. Navy found the headmen in no manner inclined to be appeased during a visit in March 1823, 4 months after the fighting had ceased. They continued to claim that they had never intended to sell the Cape to the Americans, and once again raised the issue which doubtless formed the true, and only cause of hostilities, the embarrassments thrown in the way of the slave traffic, by a contiguous active check, restraining by its presence, a trade they never can willingly forego. Around the same time as Lying's visit, a native messenger appeared outside the palisades of the settlement on Meseraudo. The chiefs, in their wisdom and mercy, had agreed to drop their demands for the last of the 8 children abducted during the Battle of November 11, extravagant demands that, Ashman had insisted, the colonists were steadily resolved not to pay. The parents, the messenger said, were welcome to come and retrieve their children. The scene was a heartbreaking one. If any redeeming trait had at this period appeared to soften and atone for the moral deformity of the native character, Ashman grudgingly wrote, it certainly was perceived in their treatment of these helpless and tender captives. The children had been turned over to elderly ladies who had been proverbially tender and indulgent. They had sent messengers to the colony to inquire the proper kinds of foods to which the children were accustomed. More than any treaty, the transfer of the children signaled a reconciliation of sorts, even if it was founded in the natives' fear of settler arms. After this temporary resolution of the conflict between native and settler, a new challenge arose, perhaps inevitably. For suppressed in the struggle against the enemy from without, the unresolved tensions within, between white paternalism and black autonomy, would soon snap the bonds between the settlers and their agent. These tensions had been gestating for years. They had first arisen in America, of course, when the vast majority of free blacks voiced their anger at both the assumptions of the ACS free blacks as a useless and pernicious people, in Clay's words, and its conclusion that they must therefore vacate their homes for the burning sun of Africa. Then, even the more amenable settlers, who had taken up the ACS's offer rather than rejecting it out of hand, rose up aboard the Elizabeth, as the white agents of the federal government and the ACS declared their intention to establish near-dictatorial authority over the settlers. These tensions would also serve as a harbinger of the future, as Liberians struggled first to gain their independence from the ACS and thereafter resisted attempt after attempt by white Americans and Europeans to assert their paternalistic authority over the Black Republic. The most consequential dispute between white agents and black colonists in Liberia's early history began in July 1823, when Ayres, having recuperated back in the United States, returned to reassume his former position. He did not like what he found at Mesurado. Ashman, his temporary and unofficial replacement, was in over his head. The colonists were running the show. Ayres exhibited the contradictory thinking that had characterized the ACS from the start. He could grow contemptuous of the black colonists for failing to live up to their duty as civilizers of the Dark Continent while at the same time condescendingly treat them as inferiors incapable of addressing even the most mundane demands of survival. To him, the confusion at Mesurado was a manifestation of the lack of white authority. With instructions from Washington in hand, Ayres gathered the settlers together shortly before Christmas and imperiously informed them that the current haphazard arrangement of houses, clustered near the water's edge for protection and convenience, would not do. New lots would be distributed at the agent's discretion. And so they were, except to those who complained. Food was of more immediate concern than real estate, however. The settlers had lost their gardens to the battles with the natives and, with the return of the rains, they had had no chance to plant anew. Yet Ayres lectured them on the merits of self-sufficiency, telling them that they had become too dependent on supplies from home and so rations would cease the following June. Then, for reasons unexplained in the historical record, he opted to return to America. Before he departed near the end of December 1823, the colonists presented him with a petition of grievances, mostly aimed at his mandates, that they insisted he take back to the ACS port. The agent was not amused, and as he took his leave at the waterside dock, he warned that anyone who refused to work on their newly assigned lots would be expelled from the settlement. It had little effect. A week later, Carey led a dozen of the colonists on a raid of the settlement's storehouse. They carefully doled out provisions as needed. Ashman, now the lone white man in the settlement, could do little but threaten to report them to the board. Yet the food shortage only worsened. On February 13, 1824, the Cyrus, carrying 105 men, women, and children from Petersburg, Virginia, arrived at Mesurado. When it was learned, however, that the ACS had failed to stock the ship with enough provisions for the emigrants, let alone those already in Africa, the colonists directed their growing anger at Ashman, who had tried to reassert his authority by imposing a 50% cut in rations. According to the agent, whose account of the incident is the only one extant, Carey confronted him in his residence, the only completed stone building in the settlement, about 5 weeks after the arrival of the Cyrus. "We," Carey said, gesturing at his fellow mutineers, "will decide who gets what and how much, not you." He then charged Ashman with secretly stocking his own larder and selling supplies to the natives to pay debts he had accrued back in the States in a failed publishing venture. That evening, March 22, Ashman called the healthier colonists to the half-finished Providence Baptist Meeting House, which survives to this day, the oldest standing building in Monrovia. He denied the charges of profiteering and made several of his own. "The evil remains," he recounts, telling the gathering in his journal, "that instead of laboring, as you ought to raise food, you would obtain it by plunder." He then pointed at Carey and accused him of mutiny. Though it should have been apparent for some time, Ashman was perhaps finally beginning to understand the reality his predecessor Ayres described in his resignation letter to the ACS board. The principle which really actuated the colonists, from the first, is, that the society had deceived them, that they went out expecting to govern themselves, and had no idea of having white agents. Everything was falling apart at once for Ashman. Despite constant pleas, he had failed to win new provisions or funds from the cash-strapped ACS board, making it impossible to buy provisions from the few natives who offered to trade with them or the occasional ship anchoring at the Cape. The only news coming from the States, in fact, were press accounts lambasting the agent, based on settler complaints to U.S. naval personnel passing through the colony. Ashman had had enough. Bleeding and in pain from a botched tooth extraction, he boarded a schooner in April for the more salubrious environs of the Cape Verde Islands, before heading back to Washington to defend himself to the board and to the American public. Yet only 4 months after what he thought would be his last glimpse of the tiny settlement on forested Cape Mesurado, Ashman returned, in good health and in the company of the ACS representative Ralph Gurley. The two had met, quite by accident, in the sleepy Cape Verdean port of Praia, a resupply stop on the 6-week voyage between the States and the West African coast. Gurley was on his way to Mesurado to relieve the allegedly incompetent and corrupt Ashman of his duties and to restore order to the settlement. but Gurley took an immediate liking to the one-time seminary teacher. He would later write Ashman's biography, and was convinced that he had the best interests of the colony and its inhabitants at heart, as well as good ideas about how to govern the place. Gurley asked Ashman to return with him to the coast and, on the week-long voyage, the two devised a more equitable division of ACS authority. The board in Washington, which consisted of some of the more active members, as well as its paid secretary and treasurer, would set general policy and the agent would have ultimate authority in the settlement. But the daily affairs of the colony would be handled by the settlers themselves or, rather, by their elected representatives. This was a radical step, and when it finally heard of the plan months later, the ACS board rejected it out of hand and then, for lack of an alternative, grudgingly relented. Meanwhile, Ashman had a pleasant surprise as he disembarked at Meseraudo, and before he could announce the new dispensation. The settlers were actually grateful to see him. Sick, hungry, and isolated, they understood their survival depended upon the lifeline offered by the ACS board and secured by the presence of a white agent. And so they made their amends. Gurley called a meeting at which he informed the colonists of the outlines of a new constitution. He probably also told them then of the board's decision to give the colony and settlement their first formal names, Liberia, from the Latin liber, or free, and Monrovia, after President James Monroe, the ACS member who had done so much to pry the necessary funds from Congress that made Liberia possible. When the meeting was over, Carey stepped forward, a picture, in Ashman's words, of Christian humility. He deplored the part he had taken in the mutiny, and acknowledged frankly that his influence had seduced others, the agent wrote. He professed his willingness to be useful in the way the agent thought fit to propose. At first, Ashman attributed the colonists' new docility to a wave of revivalism that swept over the settlement in his absence and climaxed in fervent services in the weeks and months following his return. Some of our most turbulent subjects have assumed an entirely different character, he noted in a letter to the board, which I am persuaded, nothing but the renovating power of the Word and Spirit of God can account for. Perhaps. The colonists were certainly a pious lot, every early visitor to Monrovia attested to that. But writing to the board at the end of 1824, Ashman hinted at another cause. The participation of the magistrates and council, according to the new form of government, in the deliberations of the agent, and the administration of justice, the agent wrote, has tended chiefly to form the officers themselves to a modesty of deportment and opinion, which they never manifested before, and to secure to the government the united support of the people. Governing their own affairs with as little white interference as possible, that's what the colonists had risked fever and famine for. All except Carey, who had come to Africa only to convert the natives. So when a native man calling himself John appeared in Monrovia one day in early March 1825, Carey treated it as a sign from the Almighty himself. The man said he had walked 80 miles from Cape Mount for one reason, to be baptized. In pidgin English, he recounted to the parishioners of the Providence Baptist Church a redemption story to warm their Christian hearts. Me be very bad man, suppose a man can curse, me can cuss him too, well, me go to church house, the man speak, and one word catch my heart. John paused, and placed his hand upon his breast. Something tell me, go, pray to God, but, I can't pray, all day, all night, me can't sleep, by and by, my heart grow too big, me fall down this time, now me can pray, me say, Lord, have mercy, then light come in my heart, make me love the Son of God, make me love everybody. Carey granted the man his wish and, with new clothes befitting a Christian and a small stack of Bibles and hymnals, sent him on his way. But it seemed that every circumstance had conspired against Carey's mission, the fatal sojourn at Campbell, the native wars, the necessary mutiny against the ACS, and, through it all, the business of healing, not native souls but the broken, sickly bodies of settlers. Gathering what knowledge and technique he could from the physicians on visiting ships, Carey treated the fevers, the injuries, and the infections that killed anywhere from a handful to a full third of each shipload of new emigrants. Although one of the most diligent and active men, Ashman summed up to the board a year after the rebellion, Carey has never had the command of leisure or strength to engage in any missionary duties, besides the weekly and occasional services of the congregation. Indeed, his only real accomplishment in the fields of the Lord was a missionary school at Cape Mount that the local Muslims, mostly Mandingo traders, had forced to close. Br. In March 1828, Carey acquired a new set of responsibilities. Ashman, now seriously ailing and determined to recuperate or die among family and friends in his native New Haven, made the man who had once challenged his authority his replacement. I have the greatest confidence that his administration will prove satisfactory in a high degree to the board, and advantageous to the colony. But the board appointed yet another white agent, an army surgeon named Richard Randall, to succeed Ashman. It didn't matter, in the end. Carey would be dead before his replacement could cross the Atlantic. At the end of the rainy season of 1828, natives robbed the colonists' trading post at Digby, a few miles north of Monrovia, an incident that normally could have been settled in a palaver with the chief who was responsible. But when the natives turned the outpost over to a local European slaver, Carey, as head of the colonial militia, had no choice. A slave factory an hour's walk from Monrovia demanded action. On the evening of November 8, Carey and several others gathered in the old agent's residence, now the colony's armory, to pack cartridges for the march on Digby. A candle tipped over and the gunpowder lit. The massive explosion killed 8 settlers. Carey was among them, though the sturdy former warehouseman lingered on in bloody rags, no one trained to attend to him, for 2 days. In the final tribute to its founder, the Richmond African Missionary Society conveyed a hint of the disappointment that marked Carey's life and death. We were looking with confidence to the more perfect consummation of our wishes, when that moral desert, Africa, should rejoice and blossom as the rose, the memorial read, but God has seen fit to cross our expectations.